Welcome to the INSEAD Perspectives Spotlight on Asia podcast. I am Sameer Hasija, Dean of Asia at INSEAD, the business school for the world. In this podcast series, I have the pleasure of chatting with my colleagues at INSEAD, whose research and teaching covers a diversity of business disciplines. I also have the pleasure of speaking with the region's leading business leaders. Together, we'll dive into some of the most pressing topics facing business and society today, examined through the lens of Asia. In this latest episode, I am joined by my colleagues Felipe Monteiro, Senior Affiliate Professor of Strategy, and Paul Evans, Emeritus Professor of Organizational Behavior. Felipe and Paul are two of the co-authors of the 2025 edition of the Global Talent Competitiveness Index. The GTCI offers an in-depth ranking that explores how countries are managing to develop, attract, and retain talent. Felipe and Paul, thank you very much for joining us. And let me kick this off by I guess the most fundamental question: the Global Talent Competitive Index. Why is this such a big deal now, and why is it so important now?
If you think about what is in the priority for CEOs, for policymakers, is really we live in this era of crisis. Some people call permacrisis, some people call it polycrisis. But I think there's no doubt that we're living under so much disruption. So every year the GTCI has a theme. And this year we thought, no, there's not a better theme than talking about disruption and resilience. So we believe, this is critical to countries, critical to policymakers, critical to, organizations and individuals. So this is pretty much what we are focusing this year.
Well, thanks a lot, Paul and Felipe, for sharing that. And first of all, fundamentally agree with what you're saying. Now, before I get into the results of this year's release that we are all very excited about, I want to take a little bit of or ask you a kind of a question which is related to a more philosophical debate, but I think is still relevant to what you're doing. With the new wave of technology, in particular Gen AI, becoming so powerful and so relevant in today's day and age, a lot of people are asking questions about what will people do, what will humans do, and are our skills becoming redundant? What's your view on this? Is human capability going to be relevant in the future with all the emerging technologies developing?
I would say that you already begin to see the seeds of change, and it's been there for some time. One of the things which is clear with GTCI is that the soft skills are becoming as important as the hard digital skills. And in fact, there's some interesting things because there's some countries like Philippines and so forth there, which are extremely good on the soft skills there. And we've actually known this for some time because there's researchers who've been looking at this, and they've shown that since the middle of the 1990s, the people who've been getting the pay increases are the people who've got these cooperative skills, the ability to work with other people, because nothing happens on your own. Everything happens in collaboration with other people. So that's why we introduced measures into this survey this year around those soft skills.
And I think with AI, we're going to think more and more about what are the human-centric skills. Things like critical thinking, the soft skills, and above all, the ability to adapt. How are we going to be talking more and more about adaptability? And I believe what we're going to see right here, we see already in the results this year, how some of those skills are super important for talent competitiveness.
One of the things that we noted about the countries which are doing well, including Switzerland, Singapore, and so on, is they have a fine balance between people who have more technical vocational skills and then people who have what we call the generalist adaptive skills. That's leadership, innovation, creativity, entrepreneurship. Now, it may well be that balance is beginning to change, that the generalist adaptive skills are starting to become more and more important than the technical skills. And everybody's afraid of that. That's something in future years that we're going to keep a very close eye on.
Let me just add one thing. As we look back now, with the benefit of hindsight, we look back at the different themes of GTCI. You know, 10 years ago, we already talking about talent mobility. You know, in 2020, the topic was AI in the age, talent in the age of AI. So it's interesting as we engage in those debates now about resilience, adaptability, right?
Yeah, we started to pick up actually some of these issues quite far back. I think it was about 2015, 16. Our theme that year was technology and talent and that interface. And AI didn't really exist at that particular period of time there, but it was much more digital skills. And it was clear that what was important, and this was particularly clear in the Nordic countries, which we focused upon at that particular time, that the digital skills combined with the soft human-centric skills was what was becoming important. So you start seeing things back in the past, which today become very, very relevant and right at the forefront. And I think that's what GTC is about. Sensing what is happening there and trying to help people, governments, policymakers, business leaders, and so forth, figure out what we should do.
Well, I'm glad that you shared these insights with us, because it's very important, and you, as you rightly said, for us to have a view on how do we really add value with the skills that we bring in as a complementarity to all the technology that's evolving, but more importantly also see a bit of a future direction of how things are going to evolve, so that policymakers as well as organizations can have a bit of a view on how they want to develop their capabilities, how they want to develop their talent, so that the talent is still valuable and contributing to their mission, which I think is super important. So thanks for highlighting that. It's very important. Let me come down to the results, because that is pretty exciting, and I've seen the results, and I know the results have now been released. Um, Singapore, in this edition, I think this is the 11th edition, if I'm not wrong,
Correct.
comes out as number one. And if I'm not wrong, it's for the first time. So, can you go a little bit deeper and give us an insight into what led Singapore to replace Switzerland on the top spot?
Well, let me start off by picking on one thing that you can learn from Singapore. And Singapore and Switzerland, which for a long time has been the number one, now in second place. And that is that what this is all really about is ecosystems. And what I mean by an ecosystem is it's basically business and government and educational institutions and labor organizations and the other elements of society. When there are problems that face society, forward-looking problems or opportunities, they've got to get together around tables and figure out what to do. Nothing happens in the real world unless you have that sort of collaboration, which is, I think, one of the reasons why, Singapore being a city-state, you've always had that collaboration. And I take the examples from other countries, and I'm not going to name them here, where business doesn't work with government. They can't work with each other there. And there you can talk about the issues, you can show the numbers and the statistics. Things aren't going to happen without that collaboration between the different stakeholders in the society.
And there are certain things that Singapore clearly leads, right? It leads in regulatory landscape, government effectiveness, as Paul was saying, also retaining talent and
It's always been top 5 in terms of growing talent, education, and lifelong learning. Singapore's been one of the leaders in lifelong learning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think typically people asking, oh, why those countries are at the top? And what we typically say is because they are good not only at attracting, but at retaining, at growing talent. They have a very sophisticated business landscape, that type of collaboration that Paul was alluding to. So it is important to see, right? It is not one thing. Oh, Singapore did one thing. No, Singapore did that kind of set of initiatives that implied working those ecosystems. And also, I think it is interesting to see now how Singapore is prepared, right, to the years ahead in terms of how it built, right, this talent, right, pool. Because as Paul was saying before too, if you look at this country, talent, it is the key strength.
But it's not just Singapore which has this ecosystem collaboration. It's all of the countries which have been in the top 10. I know the Nordic. I'm married to a Dane and I speak the Danish language, so I know the Nordic countries quite well. And there you have this sort of collaboration between the sectors. That's kind of the hallmark. And ever since the first year, 11 years ago on GTCI, that's kind of been the big message about success. And the problem today, faced with AI and so forth, kind of looking ahead, is that's hitting at the moment. That's an opportunity and a threat. If you're going to turn it into an opportunity, you're going to need to capitalize on that sort of collaboration between those different sectors. But Felipe, there's something which has flipped Singapore from number 2 into number 1. Do you want to talk about it?
You talked about the capacity to retain talent.
Yeah.
Because I think it is super important
It's the capacity
to retain.
retain.
Right. So it's not only the ability to attract, which certain countries are super good at, but it's the ability, once talent is here, do they stay?
How do you keep it? Now,
and lifestyle and personal safety and all those things are so important here.
Right.
And that's where you see in some of the measures and so forth there that the lifestyle. And Sameer, you're the local.
You're the
You
dean
can
of
talk
Asia
about
campus,
it
yes.
there. At least if you take the statistics, Singapore has created a much more attractive lifestyle for people. So one of the things about talent is if people have got talent, they've always got other opportunities elsewhere. And the more talented they are, the more true that's going to be. So one of the big problems for countries, cities, organizations at the high end is how you keep your people. One of the measures that we've introduced as a new measure this year is well-being, actually. And Singapore, we can't track that over time. So I can't tell you whether Singapore has become better, but it's an area where Singapore, I think if I remember rightly, is number 36 in the world, not number 1 in the world on whether people have this sense of feeling good and so forth there. But that's probably something to keep an eye on if you're going to keep the talent.
It's super interesting what both of you shared, and I can actually give you a concrete example of this. Talent development and this ecosystem thinking that Singapore has. They have an initiative here called SGLN, which is Singapore Leaders Network. And the entire aim of setting up SGLN, which is in partnership with the Economic Development Board, EDB, of Singapore, and HCLI, which is the Human Capital Leadership Institute. And the whole idea that they had was we need to have Singapore talent also take over at the top echelon of organizations and not just provide kind of technical talent or mid-management talent or operational talent. And so they are putting deliberate efforts in doing that. And not surprisingly, they got in touch with us at INSEAD and said, hey, does INSEAD want to partner with SGLN so that we can foster the growth of this top talent, which is eventually going to be running big Singaporean companies, but also multinationals that are operating both here and in the region. And of course, we happily entered into this partnership with them because we share this vision of that they have, that we need to think about how to develop talent. And believe it or not, in that vision, they believe that these leaders should actually be encouraged to go and explore the world, get experiences all over the world, because they are confident, talking about retention, that they will eventually come back and lead both Singaporean as well as multinational organizations which are based out of Singapore. So it's a long-term view. They believe in that ecosystem and they're taking deliberate action. This is not by accident. So I can tell you, even from our own experience of being here for now 25 years, we can see this in action, and this is not a coincidence. So it's very interesting to see that the results are showing a vision that they had initiated long ago, and they're now reaping the benefits of that vision.
Mm.
But your point is well taken, Paul, that they need to continue on this journey, because as the world evolves, as the things that matter to talent evolves, remaining competitive at the top will require evolving ourselves. And so Singapore will have to keep evolving.
I think that's true. One of the things which you say about Singapore, and it's true for some other top countries as well, is you've got to be forward-looking. You've got to be aware that things are changing. This will bring us back to the resilience theme later on. This world of disruption. Disruption is uncomfortable, but it's also an opportunity. So you have to be forward-looking and thinking about what that really means for education, growth opportunity, the people you want to attract, and what you want to do with other people, and so on. Yep.
And I think you were alluding, Samir, to HCLI, and it's interesting, right? Because when GTCI was established, right, and Paul was the creator of it, HCLI was our, initial partner. So now, not now that the index is well established, 11 years, but at the very beginning, they already had this kind of anticipation of how strategic and how important it is to have data
That's a very good point.
to compare across, right? Because I think what we do with GTCI, sometimes people just got interested in the rankings.
Yeah.
But what we hope is GTCI is a tool for action. And what we do, we compare 135 countries, 77 different indicators, and we put a map to senior leaders, be it in the public sector, private sector, to see, this is the talent competence landscape around the world. And it's interesting to see, right, that HCLI already 11 years back was already looking at
No,
this.
Philippe, absolutely. And it's one of the most obvious things to say, which is that we need to have a long-term, forward-looking vision. It's one of the hardest things to execute,
Absolutely.
because while most of us should be looking forward, far ahead, most leaders and managers and policymakers, most of the time they actually end up looking behind. Singapore is the exception to that rule, where there is genuine forward looking in their vision and in their execution. So I can totally see that, and so again, not surprisingly, they are in the top. Now, they are not exclusively there. There are other countries that have also done this, but this is definitely one shining example of that forward vision. Moving out of Singapore and still sticking to Asia, how does APAC as a whole, so if we leave Singapore aside, how does the Asia Pacific as a whole show up when it comes to talent competitiveness? Any insights from the research and the results that have come out that you'd like to share with us?
So, Australia and New Zealand, they've been doing super well. Australia, I think, has been in the top 10 since the beginning, New Zealand in the top 20. So it's interesting to see how those two countries, right, in the APAC region, and maybe this reflects the growing importance of APAC in the global economy. So, right, if we look in the past 10, 15, 20 years, how the center of gravity of the global economy has been moving to Asia. So somehow talent translates that. So we see those two doing very well.
I think it's worth taking some countries which are a little bit lower down the income level. I think one of the remarkable countries in the region here, which has jumped up, I think it's about 7 places this year, it's the Philippines. So the Philippines has it's always been good in terms of growing talent, and it's developed some various other areas of strength there, including, as I said earlier on, it's a place to look at if you want to understand the soft skills which are becoming important. If only you had this Philippine soft skills together with where Malaysia excels, which is on the hard digital skills, but it's kind of that combination of the two which is important. But I think one of the striking things this year about the region and about the 135 countries that we've looked at and measured is that there appears to be a kind of plateau among the higher middle income countries like Malaysia, South Korea, and so forth there, where there isn't a great deal of movement. There's movement at the top end of the top 20. There's some countries like the United States which have gone down. There are other countries which have gone up, Singapore and so on. There's movement at the bottom end of the income scale. So you've got sort of countries like the Philippines, Sri Lanka, some of the African countries like Kenya and Malawi and so forth, who've moved up, who've made some solid improvement. But in the middle, there's kind of a squeeze there, because you've got the top-end countries like Singapore, European countries, which are good at innovation, focus on innovation with the high-end skills. You've got the lower-income countries, which have got a cost advantage. And then you've got the countries like Malaysia, which are sort of squeezed in the middle. And it's not just Malaysia, it's a number of others. So for the first time, we're asking ourselves a question, which economists have looked at for a number of years, which is there a talent plateau when you kind of get to a certain level? And I'm tempted to think, but it'll take a lot more exploration to see if there's anything true to that it really takes a lot of ecosystem collaboration between the different parts of society to get out of that possible talent trap.
Yeah, so I think like economists talk about this middle income trap.
Yeah.
We are wondering, is there a parallel in the talent landscape as well? Because I think Paul was talking about Malaysia. Malaysia is 46. But if we go to other regions of the world and think about big countries too, like Brazil, Mexico, and Latin America, they reach a point that they are stuck, and they don't get worse, but they don't get better. So they are kind of in that kind of upper middle income trap. And right, and I think it's something as Paul was saying that we want to investigate further. But it's interesting to see that difficulty of going one step, improving when they are right at that level.
When you were describing this, that was the first thing that came to my mind, is that is this the middle income trap in action, just in a different format? And I can speculate. I haven't done the analysis at all, and that there must be some kind of underlying variables that explain both. That's for another conversation, but it's just great to observe this phenomena, because it is an important phenomena, and policymakers should be aware of this. These countries that you've described at the middle income or middle talent trap may also be the ones where there have been a lot of changes in the political landscape. So there is some kind of a fair amount of movement there, which sometimes can come in the way of policy. And as you described right in the
Absolutely.
beginning, that this requires an ecosystem of policymakers, government, business, education to all come together. But if one part of this ecosystem is a little bit volatile in some time period, then perhaps coming together and having a long-term vision becomes a bit of a challenge. So there are some interesting phenomena at play worth digging into deeper. I was at the APAC level, but as we all know, APAC is not one region. There's just so many regions built inside it. So I want to go into the giants of APAC, so to speak. So let's kind of focus a little bit on countries like India, like China, perhaps even Indonesia. I mean, these are the three biggest if you look at the size of the countries in Asia. Where do you think they lie? How are they doing? And more importantly, what are their opportunities and challenges from your perspective?
Right. So maybe let me start with China, right? The second most important economy in the world. And it's interesting because China decreased 13 positions this year. So it's now 53. But I think we should take it with caution, because actually, as we look at the data, we had a number of data issues with China. Some data were not being updated. That happened not only with China, but also some other countries. So we look and and we take this. Yes, there was this decrease, but we are conscious that that probably does not represent the actual situation in China, because simply we have this data mismatch. So we are really looking forward to next year to see, if we get more updated data on China and have a more accurate representation of China.
Felipe, before you move ahead, I want to underscore something. For everybody that's listening to this podcast series, I want them to remember that INSEAD stands for three very important things. That is rigor, relevance, and impact. These are the three things that to some extent define our DNA. And I want to point out that it's very important that the owners of the index come out and point out that yes, we've done our analysis, we have the index, and we're quite comfortable with it, but there are issues because we're not sure if the data is perfectly representative. And I think it's important for the audience to know that because we want to highlight that while our methodology and process is very rigorous, but there are challenges with the data, and hence there are some asterisks that we need to put into
Absolutely.
our results.
No, it's super important, right? The index, since its beginning, is always yearly, it's audited by the European Commission Joint Research Committee. Because again, we want to give the most transparency, right? So China is in that position. We are hoping that next year we're going to have better data to represent well China. And then comes India. And in India, I mean, what's the good news? Improve 3 positions. What's the bad news? Even we improve in 3 positions, it's a number 100. So, it's clearly, right, not delivering as much as its potential. So we see kind of a situation, a lot of it has to do with what we have in the index in the attract pillar. So it doesn't look like the index has been able to attract a lot of talent, including internally. So we have a sub pillar that talks about internal openness. And it looks like that in that dimension, India is not doing pretty well. On the other hand, we know how strong are the ICT industry in India. We know how international some of those companies are. So we see that mismatch, but maybe with such a large economy, when we try to kind of work on the average of the country, that's what we get. But I don't know, Samir, you know pretty well. Also, India, we have a lot of Indian partners. How do you see this?
Yeah, I'm not surprised by this. See, India has a lot of potential, and in pockets that potential is performing extremely well. But when you aggregate at the national level, is when you see that is not so. If you were to redo the rankings and pick up a few cities, and let's say we were to start ranking cities, you will see certain cities in India will start ranking pretty high compared to global cities. And so when you aggregate at the country level, that's a little bit of a problem. So, but the solution is not to make an excuse for it. The solution is for policymakers to see what can we do better? How do we unlock the potential that it offers? And if you're mentioning that talent attraction is something that needs to be unlocked to creating opportunities to making sure that talent really wants to contribute to this growing system, which I think it is going to, but they need to make it more compelling a value proposition. That's a great insight for policymakers. So my view, Felipe and Paul, is that India should not be disappointed. They should actually look at it as a great opportunity for figuring out what do they need to do.
I think another point is, India does well in the generalist adaptive skills. Also, India does well in when we look for business masters. So there are, as you say, not only geographically some pockets of excellence, but also even within our index, right, in the different variables, there are some of those variables that are India does pretty well as well. Paul.
No, I think your remark about cities is spot on, actually, there, because that's also true. I mean, the United States is a big country which has gone down about 7 points in the ranking. But I'm sure, if you take it by region, by state and so forth there, you'll see a lot of variation. You'll see some parts which are very dynamic moving ahead and other parts, and it kind of it averages out to a lower level. Yeah.
And Indonesia. So Indonesia number 80. So similar story of that kind of being not able to progress a lot. But what's interesting is Indonesia, when it comes, there's one variable that is cluster development. So basically, right, the World Economic Forum asks executives how strong, well developed are certain clusters. It looks like that Indonesia does pretty well. It's number 7 in the world. So again, as you were referring before, maybe within Indonesia, huge country, right? There's also those pockets. Not very good again in terms of talent attraction. So some room for improvement there.
Your remark about clusters, actually, Felipe, I think is also very true because, I mentioned the outstanding performance of the Philippines, but the Philippines, again, is a country with certain clear clusters, areas where it's strong and that it manages to capitalize upon well. And I think that's another lesson, as it were. You can't be good at everything, which is, for countries like that, what are you really going to focus upon?
And Paul, soft skills. Indonesia, number 13 in the world. So we'll talk
Exactly,
about soft skills
exactly.
before, and again, is an area that needs
That's
as
an
well.
area, again, if if there's a lot of evidence, growing evidence that it's in a digital AI world, it's this combination of being digitally AI savvy and yet be able to work with other people, collaborate, having these soft skills, including soft skills, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a few minutes when we get on to resilience there. And that combination can potentially be very powerful.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And it also reminds me of this analysis that I've seen some economists do, which shows that almost all the G7 countries have have not saturated, but have all converged to their GDP per capita growth to the same point, like roughly 1.2 percent year on year. Um, which means that if all the economies in the world eventually converge to the same kind of GDP per capita, I mean, getting there and then kind of growing at the same level, that means the GDPs of the world will be basically a function of their population, which makes India perhaps is going to be the biggest economy in the world, China second, US third, Indonesia fourth. I mean, that's the direction in which it's going to go. If that happens, that's how it's going to be. And I believe, based on everything you're saying, that can only happen if these countries, Indonesia, India, China, they get their talent competitiveness in the right order, because that I think is almost like a prerequisite.
Yeah.
I mean, there are many other variables that they're going to need, but getting their talent in order, planning for it, and figuring out where you're good so that you can double down on that, but also where are the gaps so that you can have policies and conversations of how to overcome those gaps. And I think once these regions, these countries can get this right, they'll be a step closer to fulfilling that promise of eventually becoming some of the biggest economies in the world, which I think is the direction in which all the economists predict. But a few things need to go right meanwhile.
Yeah.
And while I got excited
Uh,
by the conversation that we are having, and I see that as a potential, but let me step back and have you tell me, how do you see the future pan out? Like, what are your you've done this research and you've done it for a few years now, but having done it this year, how do you see things panning out in the near future? Any predictions?
so predictions. I think the conversation and the transformation that AI is gonna kind of bring to organization, to society, is gonna be massive. So my expectation is, the next few years there will be a lot of transformation in the way organizations and we think about the educational system, so on and so forth. And that kind of first question you ask, Samir, on what really makes us, what I mean, should we care about talent? What is, will machines and AI will replace? I think we'll be more and more aware, and leaders are going to be more and more aware of what are really those human-centric skills that cannot be performed, or that we don't want to be performed by, machine or AI. And a lot of that notion, as you combine about the technological change and you add, the whole geopolitical scenario that we have, it's very clear that we're gonna need more and more people who are prepared to adapt, to adjust, to learn on the job, to continue. So I think we are in a school, so we believe in education, continue education, lifelong education. I think it's gonna be pretty important going forward, and less maybe about the purely technical skills, but more and more about creativity, critical thinking, you know a lot of things that, if you think about what leaders care and how they're hiring today, is this. And let me share with you an anecdote from I teach my Global Executive MBA module in Brazil, and I was having conversation with very senior leaders there, and one of them from a top consulting firm, and she was saying, no, if you think about it, and we hire a lot of, right, they hire a lot of our students. Say, now, if you think about a lot of the things that an associate used to do, those things could be outsourced, right? Could be done by AI. But what I need is what's going to be the transformation that those new ways of operating would entail for organizations. So I need people who could have good conversations with my clients, who can, have good ways of working with them, explaining to them, working change management. So I think that change management adaptability story, we will need people to do lead them. The machines can be enablers, but I think we need people, and we need people prepared who can do that well.
Right.
Yeah, Felipe, you're talking about change management, and I think you're touching on something so important. You take AI, you take climate change, you look all the way around of us, and if you're honest, you have to say 5 years down the road is totally unpredictable. So in an unpredictable situation, what do you need? You need resilience. Our theme this year is resilience. But fundamentally, I think it's what it boils down to that is what you're saying, Felipe, which is the ability to talk with each other. And I come back to things that we said right at the outset is if in a society and a city, the government and the educational world and the business world can't talk with each other, can't collaborate with each other, I don't think that we're going to be able to overcome these hurdles. Now, what worries me is that we live in a world at the moment, fortunately not the Singapore world, but a lot of countries in the world where there's increasing polarization. And that means that people find it more difficult to talk with each other, even about simple things, let alone about complicated things. So, kind of what worries me about our ability, and this varies a lot but from country to country, is I've got this profound belief after 10 or more years with this talent index and so forth there, that ecosystem collaboration is going to become more and more important. But there are signs, worrying signs, that in a lot of countries it's breaking down.
Yeah, and Samir, you asked, what do we see in the future? It's also interesting to ask what has not changed. And I think if there's something that has not changed, and Paul was saying this, since the beginning, we saw if you really want to have, be a leader in talent competitiveness, you need to have all the set of players, right, and stakeholders working together. I mean, so there's different years, different technologies, different geopolitical scenarios. I mean, this has been a constant. The need to work together, the need to have that kind of multi-sector, multi-stakeholder collaboration, and I think there's no indication that this is going to change, at least to diminish. Right? If there's anything, it's going to be even more important.
I think actually that's looking back upon, my career as a professor at INSEAD. What's important is getting this interaction, is catalyzing and stimulating the interaction between different people where one's wrestling with these kind of issues and so forth. And that's where at the company level things start happen. And that's what I think we also need at the city level and the society level.
Well, thank you very much for sharing your insights. I could not agree more with the two of you. Paul, the only difference is you're worrying signs, and I know there are worrying signs, but I'm a eternal optimist. And I hope you will agree with me that this is the current polarization, and there will be polarization in this world, but the current damaging polarization is hopefully temporal, and that the equilibrium is us converging towards working together, because I think it's an existential issue at the end of the day. So, and I think our survival instinct will kick in to allow us to do that. Again, a very philosophical point. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts, your insights, the outcomes of your research, and of course, projecting a little bit of what may come ahead of us. It leaves me with a great sense of optimism, with a great sense of excitement, with a little sense of concern to watch out so that we don't become complacent. But by and large, I think these insights have been fascinating. So thank you for spending your time with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Samir.